Welcome to St. Francis College. My name is Alan Brodowski, and I'm the Dean of the College, Professor of Biology here. And a number of years ago, I took on the role of trying to organize our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration. This was started, I can't remember, but many, many years ago by our former president and chancellor, Dr. Frank Macchiarola. And it's been going strong ever since. The past few years, as we've gone through our commemoration of Yom HaShoah, I've been really interested, as the college has been really interested, to explore the issue of the arts and the Holocaust, and this year is just an extension of that. But today we have a really fascinating program. It's really a great coincidence that this is Pesach, Passover. And it's an understanding, and I think it's really an ideal time to remember that also long ago, when our people were under threat of slavery and torture and destruction, that we were able to escape from Egypt, from the bonds of slavery. So in many ways it parallels the Holocaust. I think that this is a very important event for the college. It's a very important event for myself. As many of you do know, I am a second generation, and I am very interested in survival of the memory of what the Holocaust does. And I think one of the great things about today's program is very much a memory that we sometimes forget, that people seek escape in many ways. They seek escape from slavery, they seek escape from bondage. What do they utilize for escape? And what they use is the arts, they use music, they use paintings, they use the written word to escape their misery, and it provides a means of defiance. In all these times we have worked with the arts in terms of memory, we do understand that is an escape, and it is a voice of defiance. I really don't want to speak much more, but we have two distinguished people here today. Maestro Murry Sidlin, who is, I guess, the founder and president of the Defiant Requiem, that really speaks about concert performances. And I really do believe that I really don't want to read everything on here, because I would urge you to read and look at, and I want to save as much time as I can. And of course, Fred Terna, an artist and a Holocaust survivor. And I think their words will be much more eloquent than mine. Please, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this morning. I thought that I would tell you a little bit about my passion regarding what I've learned and how I was attracted to dive into a rather meticulous study about the concentration camp known as Terezín. I'll share with you some of what I have learned. I'm always so self-conscious about doing this when I'm sitting next to a very distinguished person who is a survivor of Terezin, who knows it from the inside and knows the life from the inside. For us, it's a matter of facts. It's a matter of understanding as well as we can through the information, but we didn't live it, and we don't know it as they do. So please forgive me. I don't mean to take up the mantle of the not only the eyewitness but the survivor, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. I became interested in Terezín when I learned one fact, that there was a conductor in the camp who put together a volunteer chorus of 150 singers, amateurs, some professionals, some people who just love music, and put together a chorus of 150 to learn a composition by the great Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi, name we know very well for those who love opera. And he wrote a Requiem Mass. He set the text of the Requiem Mass to music. And the Verdi Requiem has probably become, if not the most performed and revered composition, religious composition in music, certainly it's one of them. And when I learned that this happened, I stumbled across a book that indicated this, and that the conductor, Raphael Schechter, recruited 150 singers and taught them the Verdi Requiem by rote because he had the only music. He had the only one score that was in the camp. So he had to teach it by rote, which meant some nights he would take the women down in the basement where there was this little harmonium, and he'd pound out the parts. Then the next night he'd bring the men down, and then the women down, and so forth, and then he'd start to put it together. And they gave ultimately 16 performances of the Verdi Requiem in Terezín. And I was astonished, and I first of all went looking for information to verify, to validate, because it seemed like something was really wrong with this picture. Why would all these people who were imprisoned for being Jewish, why would they reach out for a work so strictly connected to the Catholic liturgy? How was this received, or how was it not well received? And what about the attitude of the Nazis toward this? And what about the attitude of, by this time I learned that there was a council of Jewish elders. Certainly they had something to say about all this. Finally, I met some people who were singers in the original Verdi chorus, and they filled me in on why and how and a lot of the other things that we can get to later. So we were making a film about Terezín, and I found myself in Prague finishing the film with my colleagues. At the same time, a very close friend of mine was giving a birthday concert, his 70th birthday. He was conducting the Czech Philharmonic in Prague. He conducted there regularly, but this was going to be a special event for him, and he was allowed to bring any soloist that he wanted, so he chose his dear friend Daniel Barenboim, a name I'm sure many of you know. And so I was having lunch with the two of them in Prague. We coincidentally crossed, and my friend said to Barenboim, he says, "Daniel, Murry is here doing a film about Terezín." And Barenboim says, Terezín, that's near here, no? And I said, yeah, it's about a little less than an hour up the road. He says, well, wasn't that a showplace for the Nazis? And I said, well, that's the myth. And he says, well, what's the truth? So I gave him a 10-minute kind of Reader's Digest version of the fact that Terezín was the place that, in addition to over 1,000 concerts, there were 2,400 lectures given by 530 prisoners on every conceivable subject. And as far as the concerts are concerned, it was choral, it was cabaret, it was chamber music, it was opera and opera scenes, plus a new music studio of some 20 composers who were at work, all in Terezín. So he stared at me with a gaping look, and he turned to our friend, our mutual friend, and he said a very brief sentence that's going to take some explanation. He said, "Why don't I know about this?" Translation: why don't I, Daniel Barenboim, born in Argentina, living among Germans, at age 12, moving to Jerusalem to go to the academy to study piano and music, now living among survivors, I, Daniel Barenboim, worldly on the issue of the Shoah, the Holocaust, how is it that I don't know about this? And my friend said, that's why they're making the film. The other person I wanted to tell you about is a man named Manny Rose. Emmanuel Rose is a retired rabbi in Portland, Oregon. When I was living in Portland for 8 years, I became good friends with Manny. And I came east to do some research at the Holocaust Museum, went back, and I told Manny, I said, I just got back today from the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I could not believe, this is in the late 90s now, I said, I could not believe the explosion of materials, all the new films, all the new books, all the new recordings, all the information that had just exploded and blossomed out of that era, and quite a bit about the passion that I have, to help the passion that I have for Terezin. I said, why now? And he said, there are two reasons. Number one, this is mostly coming from the grandchildren. The children, in many cases, were bypassed, and the survivors who reconstructed families as soon as they could after the war did not really want to bring the children into that world. But the grandchildren grew up, and they're studying World War II in school, and now they want to know. They put two and two together. They hear the accent of the grandparents, they see the age of the grandparents, combined with what they have learned about World War II, and suddenly this has become much more important to them. And so they sit the grandparents down and said, I want to know, and I want to know now. So that's how a lot of this material emerged at that time. The second thing Manny said, which was really quite extraordinary, he says, in the case of world events that are cataclysmic, he says, we learn the facts almost right away, but it's the truth that takes a long time. Very Talmudic answer. And sure enough, it seemed as though we were now, at this stage, more ready for the truth that was coming out in all these materials. So I thought we would do now is I would, since Fred was actually in several camps, but he had some extraordinary time in Terezin that I know he'll want to share with you, I thought we might introduce you to the concentration camp of Terezin. We made this film called Defiant Requiem. Defiant Requiem, Requiem meaning the Verdi Requiem, defiance meaning using the Verdi Requiem as an act of defiance. And so we can't show it to you today because it's almost 90 minutes and there isn't enough time. But we do have a trailer from the film, which is about 12 or 13 minutes, and I thought we would show that to you as a primer for the further discussion that we will have about Terezin and who was there and from our perspective what it all. So that's the trailer for the film that we cannot show today. We just don't have the time. I would just like to call attention to the fact that in this trailer there are two errors that have been corrected in the film, but they have not been corrected here. One was that, to the best of our knowledge, and no one is absolutely certain about this, that Eichmann did not attend the performance with the Red Cross. It appears as though Eichmann's sightings were sort of like Elvis sightings around that time, that people thought they saw him, but there's evidence to indicate that he, that very morning, was in Budapest overseeing deportations of Jews there. The other mistake was that Rafi Schechter, when he was sent to Auschwitz, when he was deported along with several thousand other people on October 16th, 1944, did not go directly to the gas chamber. He went to 3 concentration camps beyond Auschwitz. He kept getting sent along. And Fred is an authority on that subject. We'll get to that in a second. And he did die on a death march just 1 month before liberation in 1945. So those 2 mistakes. So this is the cultural world of Terezin, exploded with all these lectures, all these concerts, and all the professionals who were there, who many of whom had not worked in the arts since 1939 after the invasion. Somehow all of this was underground for a while, and then it was allowed to come up above ground once the 3rd Commandant Ram, came in. So I would like to have some commentary now by Fred. Let me explain to you how we met, because that's connected to the film. I was showing the film and speaking it was at a commemoration of Kristallnacht at the Heschel High School in Manhattan. And after the film was over, and my commentary took Q&A from the audience, Fred came over to me and introduced himself as someone who had survived Terezin and had been in the audience for, was it three?
Three that I remember.
3 performances of the Verdi Requiem. And of course, there were so many people there, it was impossible to have a conversation, but he invited me to his home, and I went to visit him, and in that conversation, many of these issues were visited, and needless to say, I learned tremendously from them. So anyway, I would like to introduce to you Frederick Terna, who is, in addition to a survivor from these various camps, a very great artist, and I hope that you all have a chance to get a chance to see his paintings. So, Fred, why don't you give us some commentary at this point?
I have seen this trailer and I saw the film, and one of the things I cannot predict is how I would feel about it. And it varies. Sometimes I'm totally unaffected. At times it affects me a lot. Here I'm somewhere in between. Some of me at that moment is in Terezín. So I ask you for your forgiveness. My voice should break. I find it difficult to put myself into that time. Terezín was my second concentration camp. The first one was Lipa. Then came Terezín. After Terezín came Auschwitz. And from Auschwitz, a cluster of camps around Kaufering. That is, when Auschwitz was being liquidated, we were shipped out. This probably happened to Raphael Schechter, and I don't really know which camps he was shipped to from Auschwitz, and which was the last camp that sent him on a death march. I was liberated outside of Landsberg in Bavaria on April 27th, 1945. I do not celebrate my birthday. I do celebrate April 27th. And my first camp, Lipa, began on October 3rd, 1941. So if you add it all up, it's 3 years, 6 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. And I'm not saying that as a kind of a joke. Somewhere it tells you that every day was a long day, some of them a little easier, some of them very bad. The easier ones would include listening to the Requiem in Terezín. Now, you saw a huge orchestra, a chorus, I don't know how big a chorus, huge. Uncounted violins, trumpets, drums, you name it. In Terezín, it was a piano that missed some strings, and the piano was on wooden horses. That was it. Yet, somewhere, those performances are more powerful, or were more powerful to me, than this full opera house, full of top singers, choruses, full orchestra. It was performed usually in an attic of one of the barracks. It was very difficult to get there because you had to be inside your residence by 8 o'clock in the evening. So it was kind of a difficult way to people to come to these performances. How did I manage to get to them? I was in a special group that was supposed to repair things that went wrong at any time, a so-called Hundertschaft. Fixing roofs, digging dishes, do some plumbing work, emergency work. And I had a little pass, and of course I abused that pass to be out after 8 o'clock. I had to have a good excuse for it, but always manufactured to get out somehow. It wasn't only that. There was an enormous amount of life going on in Terezin. And while we hear about the misery and the death and the sickness, what kept us going was a civilization. We, the inmates of Terezin, remained what we were, a group very much like you people, interested in the arts, in culture. We were treated the way nobody should be treated, yet to each other we said good morning and please and thank you. In that jammed condition, triple beds, hundreds of people in a small room, there was no personal violence, there was no crime. How come? It was a group cohesion. We were not going to behave like these, our oppressors. We were a civilized group. And I think that that kept us going to the extent that the internal life could do it. We held up a certain standard. We could not influence the Nazis. They sent 1,000 people to their death in Treblinka. There was no way of escaping them. But while we were alive, from the very first camp, Lipa, Terezin, Auschwitz, and the camps of Kaufering, we all behaved in a civilized way. We would not do what our oppressors did. Now, you can tell that I could talk a lot, but it upsets me a lot, and I still feel I have to talk about it. So.
Let me ask you a question. When you were a relatively young man when you were in Lipa and Terezin, yes. Were you 20 yet?
When I got to Lipa, I was not quite 18.
Uh-huh. And your family, were they also deported to the camps? What happened?
I'm the only one in the family that survived.
But were they also sent?
They went first to Terezin. My brother, for instance, grandmother, shipped in early 42 to Terezin, and from there transshipped, put into another transport that went to Treblinka. I met my father in Terezin, and he was one of those people who lectured. There's a book by a young Israeli lady, Elena
Markova, yes,
yeah.
Called University Over the Abyss.
Yes.
I recommend that.
Yeah, he is listed in there with his lectures.
So he was one of the lecturers, you were saying?
He was one of the lecturers, yes. So we only know today about the highlights of the cultural life in Terezin. Yeah. What one doesn't see is the misery, the hunger, the disease. For old people, Terezin was a death sentence. There was no medication. There were many doctors, but no medicines, no facilities. Anybody with a serious disease or injury really had to die because there was no way of helping. Being at that time, when I got to Terezin, I was 20 years old, so I was in physically good shape. The fact that I survived physically is a pure statistical accident. I don't take any merit whatsoever. Just a dice thrown in a certain way, luck, nothing else, pure luck. However, the fact that I survived spiritually, I thank my father and the community around me who held up certain ethical and moral standards, and they were as firm as can be. They were firm then, they're firm today. We knew from the very beginning that the Nazis were doomed, that their days were counted. It was just an absolute certain within us that the Third Reich would not survive. It didn't. What we did not know was that most of us wouldn't. But that knowledge of the certainty of the dictatorship falling to pieces, killing itself, as it were, was an absolute certainty. And, you may have more questions.
Yes, I do. I wanted to ask you, you once told me that you were in the audience for the performances. I would love to know from you, what did that mean? What did you feel? What did you sense? What did this music coming off the stage from your compatriots, how did this all affect you?
Well, so the first loudest voice was Verdi. But more important, we had discussed these things before. How come? Well, Requiem, come on, liturgical music. But there was one difference. We knew the text. Dies ire, dies ille, solvet seculum cum favela. We knew what the text said. You have to stand before the judge before long. And somewhere that came through loudly. And
you also mentioned something to me that I've never forgotten, and I think it came off your lips so quickly. It was a kind of poetic, beautifully philosophical, poetic observation that you just sort of swung through, and it hit me very hard. When you talked about harmony, you talked about that there they were, acting harmoniously. This was a group of people, of 150 people in a choir, being guided by a conductor, not led by someone who my parents would have said Schreigewalt. Go ahead.
Wait. You mentioned 150. Never was 150. It was 40, 50, 60 sometimes.
Yeah.
But what happened? There were transports out of Terezín, and people were shipped out.
Yep.
And Rafik had to start teaching everybody from scratch again.
Yeah, there were 3 choruses altogether, and some survived, and they were in the second and third and fourth performances, and that made the rehearsals go a little faster. But you're right that there were 3 performances. After each one, there was decimation of the chorus.
Yes.
But the issue of people being harmonious on stage together as a symbol to the audience.
We were one, audience and performers, if that's a word for it. This was the same, a community singing to itself.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you have to get the setting. An attic of a barrack, dark, damp, dusty, barely enough ventilation when it was hot. And there we were listening to that music, singing that glorious music. Just the piano. You hear that huge orchestra. But what came across was the feeling of the music. I think that something was exchanged there. What was exchanged was civilization.
Yeah. I want to mention something about the orchestra here, because it's true, in Terezin they had no orchestra for the Verdi Requiem. There were very few instruments, mostly chamber musicians, some very great ones who were there. And there was even a bit of a jazz band called the Ghetto Swingers, run by a man named Martin Roman, whose career was quite good after the war. He survived, and he had an extensive career even here in New York. But Schechter, according to the singers who I have met and become very close with, he said to the chorus a number of times, all of this is a rehearsal for when we will go to Prague and sing in a beautiful concert hall with a grand symphony orchestra. So when we perform Defiant Requiem as a concert performance, as a concert drama, which we've done in New York a few times now, most often each movement begins with the solo piano, slightly out of tune as well, intentionally, and then evolves into the orchestra. So we have the reality and the ideal, and usually at the end of the movement, it evolves back into the piano. So we serve the ideal of Schechter's dream that they would perform the Requiem with a great orchestra, but we also are very mindful of the reality that he did not have such an orchestra. I think we could invite the audience for questions now. There's a lot more that we could be saying, but if there are issues that you would like to address, especially to Fred, but of course to me as well, if you wish, we'd be very happy to hear from you.
The last camp I was in, near outside Kaufering, Landsberg, actually Kaufering 4, I weighed 35 kilos, give or take 70 odd pounds. You've seen sort of shuffling skeletons wrapped in a blanket. That was me. And I wasn't sure whether I would make it. At that point, I hadn't eaten for a long time. More important, didn't have enough water to drink.
Could I ask you to hold your microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I was in a bad shape. I wasn't sure whether I would make it. So I was very carefully fed first, slowly. I knew not to eat too fast. It took, well, let me now shorten this. I was eventually shipped back to Prague in a stretcher, hospitalized there. It took me a long time before I was really able to function physically. Mentally, I was all right. However, that difficulty arose later on. That is, how does one live with a memory? That is, there is first the physical recovery, comparatively easy, comparatively meaning it took time. I was young, 23, not quite, 22. And I found that the difficult part was to live with the past. And it is a difficulty that I deal with to this day. In some areas, it is easier. I'm a painter, and what I paint is that experience and around it. I do not illustrate ever, ever. I cannot do it. I don't want to do it. I cannot do it because I know it cannot be done. What I can paint is feelings, attitudes, ideas. So living with the memory, and this is what you're doing here at this very moment. You are participating in that memory. My task, Murray's task, is to keep the memory alive. What do I do? What should I do to have school children, for instance, this college, to keep the memory alive? If somebody had told me in Terezín or Auschwitz or anywhere else that there is a college in New York City, in Brooklyn, that will commemorate this event 70 odd years later, I'd say, come on, you need to see somebody about these things. And yet, here it is. We remember Murray with his movie. And today, courses throughout the world. Today, there isn't a respected place of learning that does not have a course about the Shoah, the Holocaust, and there are museum departments. That is, for some reason, I take pride in being one of those handful who try to keep that thing going, keeps the memory alive. And you are part of it. And I
Thank you for
appreciate
asking.
it.
You can get the film on Amazon, but it was on Netflix for a couple of years, but that contract ran out, so I can't send you there any longer. Okay,
The question was, how do I live with the memory? Somewhere I managed. You know, I'm 92, so I've somehow managed to live with it. The Shoah is there all the time, and somewhere I've learned to live with it. Took a while. Perhaps part of it is that I paint it. That is my way of a kind of a catharsis. Something bothers me, I put it down on a canvas and get rid of it. And of course something else comes up, try to put that on a canvas. I'm very fortunate. I was married to another survivor who was very, very much affected by the Shoah. She died long, long ago. I'm now married to my wife Rebecca, who is somewhere in the audience, and I'm very, very fortunate. I mean, I have a wonderful wife, a promising son, a roof over my head, close to where, a nice community to be connected with. I'm very, very fortunate. I'm aware of that, and that gives me some satisfaction. Yes, terrible things happened. I managed to live. That, in a way, is a personal answer, but also goes for other people. I don't want to talk about you. There are terrible things that happen in life, and yet there is a way to find a balance to live with that unhappiness, to lead a satisfying life, to figure out what counts. So I think I've learned that. For all the things that I've learned from all these experiences is to evaluate what really counts. And I think what it is the quality of life, not the things that we count as money and glory and whatever goes with it. It is the quality of life that is important. And much more, to live in a community that is fair, open, just, and one where we feel that we are all responsible for each other. And that perhaps keeps me going.
It's very beautifully put. You have seen, but to follow up on this question, you've seen with your own eyes and experienced a darkness within mankind that none of us who haven't been there can possibly imagine. I mean, we're in awe and we're shaken by it. And anytime something horrible happens in the world, we're reminded of what man can do, the incorrectly, problematically, the wrong direction of mankind. And I don't know that, and I'm not sure, have we learned anything from what happened in the Holocaust era?
I am afraid that we have learned a tiny bit. And it's people like you that sort of bring it back. Yes, we've got to do more, we've got to be involved. Every now and then I have the opportunity to speak to younger people, and I've limited my speaking. As I get older, it drains me more and more. I tell them, why did it happen? And the answer that I have is that there were good people in Germany, but they didn't get involved. That is, politics is dirty, let George do it. It's not their business. And before we knew it, the scoundrels took over, the murderers, the thugs. So the answer I tell to youngsters is, you've got to be involved. You got to be involved in the details of it. If you go to vote, too who were the candidates to become nominated? Moreover, who nominates the nominators, and why did they get to where they are? That is, we have to be involved at every level, part of the community. By the time it comes to voting, it's too late.
I've spoken to some of the people from Terezin who were singing in the choir, and I asked several of them the obvious question: did you feel abandoned by God? Did you ask, where was God? And two of them, separate, said the same thing. They said, no, God was with us. The question is not where was God, the question is where was man? And I think that's exactly what you're saying.
Well, you can tell from my remarks. I'm a secular person, but I'm also a member of a synagogue a few blocks down the block, and involved up to my ears. And am I participating in their prayers? No, but I'm with my community. And I think that by and large the community holds up the values that we cherished at Terezin, that you cherish. So, where was God? The question didn't even arise.
While you were in the concentration camp, what kept you going? Was there hope that you would return to your former life?
Oh, there was total conviction that we would survive. There was wasn't a question of hope. It was an absolute rock bottom awareness. It wasn't even belief. That thing would not last. The Nazi regime would go down the drain. And again, it did not need to be explained or hoped for. It was a given. What we did not know is what the consequences would be physically and emotionally after the war. And that was something that we know about, but really could not do much about. We survivors, I'm sorry.
No, please.
The survival rate was minimal. Of those who survived, there was an unbelievable number of suicides. Unfortunately, we did not know how to handle it. We returned, and essentially we were told, come on, it's over, live. Forget the past, live it up. And of course, the silence was deafening. We were not allowed to get into our old homes or being cared for. It took about 20 odd years before the word Holocaust or Shoah came up. Until then, it was something that was comfortably denied, or a psychologist I knew coined the word conspiracy of silence. Nobody wanted to talk. It wasn't until the 1960s that books were published, that there was more research done, that there was even the idea of teaching about it. So it took a long, long time.
There is some action that was taken, in addition to the Verdi Requiem as an act of defiance. There was some action taken by some of the composers in the camp. There were quite a number, about 20 composers, and about 4 or 5 who became very well known. Maybe the most famous of all of the composers there was a man named Victor Ullmann. He wrote altogether 7 piano sonatas, and the 7th sonata in the camp is, to me, the most interesting because it carries with it some messages. It's not unusual for music to carry messages. Beethoven did it all the time, and others did too. But Ullmann in the 7th piano sonata, in the 5th movement, he starts with a composition, a Hebrew folk song, Rachel, as a way of saying that he has kind of refound or rejuvenated his Jewishness, which he had abandoned. And then there's also, in that same movement, hidden inside the inner voices, a representation of a Lutheran hymn, "Now Thank We All Our God." And at the same time we hear the Lutheran hymn, underneath of it, we hear a Hussite warrior song. Now, what Ullmann is saying is that, you know, the Lutheran hymn represents the Germans, and the other represents the Czech spirit from Terezin, and that this was going to be overtaken, and they will come out on top. Going back to the 3rd movement of this sonata, he begins the movement as a parody on Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Now, Wagner, as you know, in addition to being a vicious anti-Semite, was the most revered composer of the Third Reich. So here is this parody on Tristan and Isolde. And then he starts to imitate the dissonance of his teacher, Ullmann's teacher, Arnold Schoenberg, who, you know, cornered the market on dissonance. So what happens was that this movement goes on and it becomes dismantled by Ullmann in the language of Schoenberg. So the idea is, if these two Jews could take apart Tristan and Isolde, the Third Reich doesn't have a chance. And I'm sure that was what was indicated in that work. I would like to just take a moment to invite you next week, the series of events that we're having at the Czech Center on, is it May 3rd, which is Tuesday night, I believe. We're having a performance of a play entitled The Tin Ring. And this is a story of a wonderful survivor of Terezin and other places, Zdenka Fantlova. And it's a one-woman show which stars Jane Arnfield, who is here this today, and it is a brilliant, brilliant play about the life of Zdenka Fantlova and how she was in a pile of the dead and found to be twitching or something of that nature, and she survived. And but a remarkable woman, and so brilliantly portrayed. And that, I believe, is on Tuesday night, is it not? At 8 o'clock. And then the film is Wednesday evening, and on Thursday evening, a performance entitled Hours of Freedom, where we will present some 18 compositions that were written at Terezin by 15 composers. And so these compositions are short, so it's not like one of those marathon concerts, but I do hope that you will come and become familiar with Zdenka through Jane's work and the film that we saw the trailer for today. That'll be on Wednesday night and Thursday night, Hours of Freedom. You're welcome, as it's all free, so you can find out information if you go online to the Czech Center or to the Defiant Requiem Foundation. You can find it there. Was there a revolt in one of the camps that and the inmates would take over from the Nazis?
Now, I cannot talk about other camps. I was only in 4 of them. And by the time we got out of Auschwitz to the last, Kaufering was not one camp, but a cluster of camps. We were so emaciated, so weak, that any resistance just didn't arise. We were surrounded by guards with dogs, barbed wire, starved. Our food was 600 calories a day, guaranteed to kill you within 4 or 5 months. And hard work in between, 12-hour shifts with a long march to the work site and back from the work site, standing interminably being counted. In winter, with just that striped pyjama, like he said. Resistance? Yes, we loved to do it. Could we do it? Was being foolish, because we knew the slightest resistance shown would mean the death of hundreds at the same time.
I think that's a very critical point. That even if you're willing to give up your own life for resistance, the deaths you may cause by the retribution of the Nazis was well known. And take the case of Lidice, for example. You know, once the underground killed Heydrich, here they destroyed a whole village and everyone in it.
And
they
the
did,
cattle.
and the cattle. And they didn't blink.
destroyed the
They
village.
didn't blink. They didn't blink. These people were not human, and the disaster that awaited children and everybody else who was defenseless. So I'm sure it crossed their minds many times how they would love to do that, but the way that they resisted and fought back was through these 1,000 concerts, these 2,400 lectures. Every day they stayed alive, I think, was a day that defied the Nazis.
What you are saying is, how could
Sorry.
you asked how could a commandant throw a child into a fire and go home and play with his children? We were well aware of that. And to find an explanation, I'm not sure I have one. I'm not sure there is one. What we have to do is be aware that there are certain uncontrolled people with power who wield that power and do not look right or left. That is, the uncontrolled power is evil. That is, any time somebody has the possibility of acting at will, without due respect for the community, this is bound to happen. So our job is, how do we keep the scoundrels from taking over? How do we make it impossible for a guy to take a child and throw it into a fire? I don't have a full answer, except saying, be involved, stay involved.
I think the other question she had was, when you were able and found your health, how did you get to the United States? I mean,
Just pure luck. It took a long, long time. I was a typical refugee. Look, by the time I got into here in 1952, that was 7 years after liberation, and had to do with the McCarran-Walter Immigration Act, which doesn't exist anymore. I was on an Austrian quota, happened to be born in Vienna. A sad story, how long it took. It was a struggle, but I managed, and here I am.
I think many of us actually forget one very important issue, that between 1933 and 1945 there was insanity. And then from 1945 until mid-50s, there was chaos. And so those of us who lived in that era, not as Fred lived, but can honestly say that we understood the insanity and saw the chaos of all those years until Europe finally settled down. But the pictures of the survivors and the people, they just roaming, looking for ways to live, to find places. It's horribly present in our minds as we look at the news today. Yes, please. That's a big one.
You know, give me a few hours to think about it. You know, it changed constantly. Look, I lived, fortunately, from day to day, solving one problem after another, and very, very luckily arrived here in this wonderful place. how did it happen? It changed from day to day. There was this miserable moment, that happy moment, miserable moment, happy moment, work. I don't have an answer. Somebody promised to write a biography of me. I refuse it. But one of my shortcomings, my wife had been urging me to write a biography. Forget it. But I paint. There was somebody back there who had hand up.
Sorry, way in the back, please. Yes.
No, when I got to Terezín, I was 20 years old. There was no art supplies. Forget it. I actually started to work as an artist in Terezín. I wasn't quite aware of it. I was digging a ditch. Somewhere I've written about it. And it was pouring. We were so far. It was raining so hard the ditch was filling with water. I was standing underneath an overhang with some other people who were digging. Found a piece of paper and a stub of a pencil and drew what was in front of me, which were poplar trees. And I looked at it and said, hey, not bad. And that was the beginning.
An auspicious beginning. The last question. Yes, please, ma'am. Is it a common occurrence?
A very common occurrence. You stand somewhere, or I'm thinking of Lipa, the first camp. You got up in the morning, somewhere the order came, everybody pack up your things, whatever you have, and we were put into a railway cart and shipped to Terezín. Right there and then. All this within an hour or less. Shipped out of Auschwitz, I didn't know where I was going. I was not sure we would not go into the gas. So suddenly, instead of being shipped or directed to the gas chambers, we were directed to the railway landing. There was the cattle cars, and we were jammed into it, and for a long, long ride, a difficult ride, from Auschwitz to Kaufering, that is Bavaria.
I think we would like to thank you for attending today. I'm very grateful for Fred to be here. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Maestro. Thank you, Fred. I find it very difficult to conclude. It's been so captivating and moving, and I think this is one of the most moving sessions that we've had, so I want to thank you. I was looking for a phrase to conclude, and I've been busy writing. I just got lost in not knowing what to say. But I think one thing I do want to say is that we sometimes say that the character of a person or the character of a people is how they respond to helplessness, which is something that you've done. But in my mind, the character of men and the character of a people is how they preserve the memories of what has gone on. And I commend both of you for doing the most incredible work that I've seen. So thank you for coming.